Hey there everyone, Mychal A. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology. And before we dive into today's program, I just want to say a major thank you to all of you who've been supporting my work by purchasing my books, Mastering Traditional Astrology, Horary Astrology and the Natal Promise, and the New Western Medical Astrology. Thank you all so much for supporting the work that we do over here and for supporting me as a self-published author. And if you haven't already purchased my books, please make sure to go over on Amazon and grab yourself copies today so that you can dive into this wonderful world of magical astrology that I've curated for you within these 3 books. And if you've already purchased copies of these books, then please make sure to leave us a review over on Amazon, because that is how Amazon supports me as a self-published author. Once again, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and do enjoy today's program. Hi there everyone, Mychal A. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and today we're going to be taking a look at the upcoming Saturn-Neptune Conjunction in Aries. Now, a part of why I think this is so important for us to do is because, one, I think it's highly important for us to spend a lot more of our astrological efforts not only in looking at ourselves and the issues that constellate around our own individual lives, but I think it's also important for us to realize that we are part of a much larger global ecosystem, and our individual destiny is just as impacted by our global destiny as is the destiny of anybody else. And I think that very often we tend to use our astrology to lock us into this ivory tower of individual identity. And that often blocks us off from realizing that that is not a truth of life. We all live within the fabric of nature, and therefore, just as much as nature is impacted by the larger cosmic tides that are occurring around and within her, we also are impacted by those same cosmic tides. So today, what I would like to do is begin by diving into the Kabbalistic Tarot, because the Kabbalistic Tarot is a pictorial representation of the forces of nature in dynamic action, and it shows how those titanic forces of nature directly impact our lives. So I want to dive into the Kabbalistic Tarot as a means of giving some level of context for the work that we're going to be doing today. And by extension, I would also like to look at the charts for the Saturn and Neptune conjunction in Aries and just speak about what that looks like as we move towards this new future in which we do have these 2 planets coming together in Aries. And I think it's also necessary to speak about the fact that they are going to be conjoining each other, standing on the cardinal axis. As many of you know, the cardinal axis is a very important part of the work that we do as Uranian astrologers, and therefore the coming together of these 2 planets isn't only significant because it happens so infrequently, but the coming together of these 2 planets is also a necessary thing for us to observe and acknowledge, particularly because they're coming together on the cardinal axis. So we're going to discuss what that means as well, and how that impacts the world at large, and how it also impacts us if we are people who have the Saturn and the Neptune together within our overall natal chart. If we are going to be impacted by that, we need to know some things about it as well, and I'll be giving you insight about that as well. If this is your first time tuning into us here on the Oraculos podcast, this is your touchstone for concrete astrology here on the internet. So please do, if you love the work that we're doing here, please make sure to go down below and like and subscribe to the Oraculos podcast and share this podcast with your other astrologically and magically minded friends. So let's begin with the Kabbalistic Tarot. I think that oftentimes in astrology, we get so caught up within the technical part of what we do as astrologers that we forget that astrology is a part of a larger magical tradition. And the astrology within itself is very similar to interpreting the weather. Basically, it tells us what to expect and what's coming up. However, in the same way as we don't necessarily turn to the meteorologist to give us some inspirational interpretation of the weather. We just expect the cold, hard facts. It's quite similar to astrology in that we don't really expect the astrology to give us some major interpretation of the weather. We just expect the facts of what that weather is going to be. So that's the reality of astrology as a tool to simply describe what's occurring within the world around us. And as a result of that, we oftentimes need other tools that are rooted within divine inspiration that can give us a sense of context regarding what we should now do now that we know what the weather is. And to that end, we're going to take a look at the Kabbalistic Tarot, because the Kabbalistic Tarot is one of the sister sciences of astrology, and more specifically horary astrology, as is geomancy, which is another tool that we have at our disposal within the traditional corpus of Western mysticism. So we're going to start by diving into the Kabbalistic Tarot for a bit, and I'm going to pull 3 cards today. The first card is going to indicate to us what it means for us to be having Saturn ingress into Aries. And our second card is going to be an indication of what it means to have Neptune ingressing into Aries. And finally, the third card is going to be an indication as to what it means to have both of these planets crossing the cardinal axis. The question, as many of you know, the question that I think is important in approaching divination is that reading specific to you to begin with? Because if you can't find yourself within the core of that reading, then chances are you shouldn't be asking that question. However, as a means of rooting this in the realities of those of us who are joined here right now, I'm going to craft a question that is universal enough to reflect the potencies of these upcoming combinations, but also personal enough where we can find ourselves within the heart of that. And so to that end, I'm going to ask the question, what lesson are we meant to learn with the upcoming ingress of Saturn into Aries, Neptune into Aries, and ultimately their conjunction? So what is the lesson that we are meant to learn as a collective by way of the upcoming ingress of Saturn into Aries, Neptune into Aries, and ultimately their conjunction? So I'm going to focus on that question in my head and in my heart, and I'm going to pump that question into the cards while I shuffle them. And I want you to also focus on that question in your head and in your heart, and I want you to pump that question through the screen into these cards while I shuffle them. And as you all may know, I do also pull up the horary chart of the moment as a means of using that also within the overall delineation. All right, so the first card that we have coming up is going to be indicative of the lessons we're meant to learn as a result of Saturn ingressing into Aries. The next card will give us indication as it pertains to Neptune ingressing into Aries. And the third card will give us an indication as to what their conjunction is indicating in general. The first card symbolizes Saturn in Aries. And this card is the King of Swords, the King of Swords upright. And the King of Swords is representing the fiery part of the air element. When we see this card within the Kabbalistic Tarot coming up, it is a card that indicates that as a result of the Saturn ingressing into Aries, we are all going to need to be that much more prudent and that much more mindful of how we are actively engaging with the world around us. One of the things with Saturn ingressing into Aries is that we know that when Saturn is in Aries, he's in the sign of his fall. And one of the manifestations of Saturn in any fire sign is that there is this tendency towards overdoing. There's this tendency towards overextending ourselves. There's this tendency towards trying to tax the living fire that is within us and cause it to extend itself in ways that are inhumane and unhuman, fundamentally, to the point where we completely burn ourselves out. And so very often when we have Saturn in any fire sign within our charts, whether that's Saturn in Aries, particularly Saturn in Aries or Saturn in Sagittarius, not so much Saturn in Leo, but when we have Saturn in Aries or Saturn in Sagittarius, one of the manifestations of that could be us not necessarily knowing how to practice discrimination with our own use of our resources and our own use of the tools at our disposal. And as a result of that, we overextend ourselves, we burn ourselves out, and we push ourselves past the point of no return. And so as we're moving into this period of having the Saturn ingressing into Aries, the universe is saying to us collectively, we have to be mindful that even as the world takes on this level of unpractical or non-practical pushing of itself forward within this coming year, we also have to find a way to centralize ourselves within the seat of our intelligence within ourselves and ensure that we aren't allowing ourselves to be pushed in that same way. When we don't have ourselves centered within the discriminative part of our consciousness, then anything that blows our direction will also move us in one direction or another within life. However, this King of Swords card is coming up, and it is saying that we have to practice extreme prudence, extreme discrimination, and extreme intelligent selection of how we choose to show up within the world within this coming year of 2026 and even beyond. So Saturn in Aries does have the impetus of pushing us and forcing us to do things that we really shouldn't be doing because it is beyond the scope of our ability, and therefore leading us into places where we are physically exhausted and unwell. But ultimately, this card is saying to us that we all need to test everything that comes to us based on the sword of our intelligence. And if those things do not pass the test of the sword of our intelligence, then we need to deny those things from having access to our own internal stores of energy. Because independent of this level of discrimination, chances are we too are going to fall victim, and we too are going to fall prey to allowing ourselves to be used by a world on fire that doesn't have the consciousness to calm itself down. And if we are on fire and the world is on fire, then there is no true sense of finding peace or finding our own central midpoint in the year to come. So this King of Swords card is saying to us that the lesson of having the Saturn ingressing into Aries is that we need to root ourselves in our own midpoint of peace and operate from that place, and not let anything disturb us from that peace, and not let ourselves within ourselves feel as if we need to be forcing ourselves to do more than what is actually possible for us to do within this coming year. If you love the astrology that you see here on the Oraculos podcast and you want to dive into the lab where we are practicing not only this astrology, but also the magical tools that have made me who I am today, then by all means join us in Mychal's Cosmic Conservatory. In Mychal's Cosmic Conservatory, I teach you everything that is within me, not just about astrology, but also about the magical practices such as the Kabbalistic Tarot, geomancy, and other forms of astral divination, so that you can increase not only your astrological knowledge, but also so that you can deepen your spiritual connection to this astrology that we know and love. So if this is something that you're interested in, then by all means join us in our members-only space, Mychal's Cosmic Conservatory, and dive into the magic that we share there each and every month. Now, the next card is going to indicate our Neptune ingressing into Aries, and what is the lesson for us to learn as a result of that? This next card is the Eight of Wands upright, and the Eight of Wands, interestingly, is indicating Mercury in Sagittarius. And I think it's interesting because we use this first card to indicate Saturn in Aries, which is the sign of Saturn's fall. And now we're looking at Mercury in Sagittarius, which is the sign of Mercury's detriment. So both of these cards are having to do with these planets that aren't necessarily operating from their midpoint, as it were. And we use both of these cards to indicate a planet in a fire sign, which is the Saturn ingressing into Aries. And now we have this card which represents Mercury in a fire sign, which is Mercury in Sagittarius. So Neptune's ingress into Aries is caught up within this idea of swiftness, because that word swiftness is what this card represents. The Eight of Wands is the Lord of swiftness within the Kabbalistic Tarot. And when we see this card, it is indicating to us that, once again, we're going to find ourselves, as a result of the Neptune ingressing into Aries, we're going to find ourselves in a period of time where everything is happening swiftly around us. The ground beneath our feet will feel as if it's changing swiftly. The circumstances of our lives will feel as if they're changing swiftly. Everything will take on this fluidity and this oceanic nature of constantly moving forward. And in the process of that, it's very easy for us to find ourselves getting lost within the current of that. And so this card, the Eight of Wands, is saying, on the one hand, this period of having the Neptune ingress into Aries is a wonderful time for us to dream a dream regarding what we choose and what we are trying to see manifest within our lives as we move towards the future. Because, one of the things with Mercury and Sagittarius, from even a medical astrology perspective, is that very often if a person has Mercury in Sagittarius and that planet is afflicted by Uranus, for example, that can represent a person who is thinking at such a speed that other people around them want to diagnose them with some form of attention deficit. But it's not that that person has an attention deficit, it's because that person is moving so rapidly within their own minds that it's difficult for the rest of us, moving at a slower pace, to keep up with them. And so this card, the Eight of Wands, is saying that the tendency of this coming period of having the Neptune ingress into Aries is indicating that there is a swiftness that we're going to find manifesting within the world at large. And that swiftness is going to be something that might be difficult for us to keep up with. However, going back to the Saturn ingressing into Aries, we need to ask ourselves whether or not it's actually important for us to keep up with that swiftness, and whether or not the way in which the world around us is moving is actually in alignment with our own values. Because if it's not, then we need not alter our dreams to reflect the tides of that changing world. So that's one thing that we're having from this combination of cards together. However, on the other hand, if we do find that the world is goading us in a direction or pushing us in a direction that is in harmony with the sorts of dreams or the sorts of desires that we have for ourselves, then this card is saying to us that it is completely appropriate to ride that current and allow that current to take us towards the manifestation of our desires. However, one of the challenges with the Mercury and the Sagittarius is that those desires can oftentimes be a dime a dozen. You look in one direction and there's another set of things that you desire to manifest. And you look in another direction and there's 10 other things that you desire to manifest. So this card is most intelligently coupled with this card insofar as this card is saying to us that we need to practice the skills of discrimination within this coming period of time of having Saturn ingress into Aries. And at the same time, a part of discrimination is being discriminative with our own selves and being discriminative in terms of how we ourselves are applying our energy. So it's not just saying, oh, I'm going to practice discriminative awareness towards people coming into my life, but oftentimes we have to practice discriminative awareness in terms of how we use our own universal life force energy within this lifetime to fulfill our own desires. Because sometimes we can desire at a rate that's far grander or far wider than what is possible for us to manifest at any singular moment in time. And so these two cards together are saying to us that yes, we do need to practice discriminative awareness with others around us, but we also need to exercise that same discipline in practicing discriminative awareness with ourselves and with our own desires, because chances are our desires will also need to be checked and vetted and analyzed and given permission to pass or not pass based on the level of desires that might be manifesting within us within this coming period of time. And now the final card that's representing the conjunction of the Saturn and the Neptune in Aries is the Justice card. I find it interesting how the Justice card and the King of Swords card, they look quite similar. And the only thing that is dissimilar about this spread is the card that we find between them. So these are our 3 cards. The Justice card, interestingly, is representing the sign Libra within the Kabbalistic Tarot, which I also think is interesting because we're speaking about Saturn in the sign of his fall, which is Aries, and the sign of Saturn's exaltation is coming up as the final card, which is representing the coming together of Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And the Justice card is representing a state of equilibrium. And that is essentially what we're finding with these 2 planets coming together in Aries. Because with Saturn and Neptune, the 2 of them represent 2 completely different sides of the scale. Saturn represents the power to make things manifest, and Neptune represents the power to make things dissolve. And so, if we are having these 2 planets come together in Aries, we're having essentially what could very well break out into a warfare between the powers of manifestation and the powers of disillusionment, or the powers of manifestation and the powers of dissolving. And that is a tenuous balance. And so the fact that we have the Justice card coming up as the final card that's representing the conjunction of the Saturn and the Neptune is saying that we ourselves need to be aware of how we navigate a state and a sense of balance between these 2 powers. On the one hand, we have the Saturn, which wants to create, because the Saturn continues to be invested in the world that's unfolding. And on the other hand, we have the Neptune, which completely wants to dissolve, because the Neptune finds itself completely disillusioned in the world that is. And so this year, and this period of time in which we're having the Saturn and the Neptune together in Aries is quite a tricky period of time, because what we've seen historically with the coming together of these 2 planets, not necessarily in Aries, but their conjunction in general, is that it oftentimes is representing a period where we have one side of the world trying to build and one side of the world trying to destroy. And this is why we oftentimes see this conjunction happening during periods of warfare or during periods of massive advancement away from our previously established norms. This Saturn and Neptune conjunction in Aries is representing a tenuous period for all of us in which we're going to have to decide, what are we participating in the most? Are we participating in building our lives and fortifying our lives for the future that we find ourselves living in? Or are we going to find ourselves in a place where we feel as if we need to destroy and let go and completely wash away all of the fabric of the content that we've established within our lives previously as a means of living for a moment in a place of nebulousness and living for a moment in a place of nothingness, because we feel as if the stuff that we've acquired is too heavy and too dense, and we find ourselves in a state of deep disillusionment regarding those things. So this is where we're going to stop our Kabbalistic Tarot insight into these planets ingressing into Aries, and that is going to be the basis from which we now dive into our astrological assessment of these themes. And it stands to reason that as we dive into the astrological charts, we're going to find these same themes coming up for us yet again.